Good morning and a warm welcome from my side as well. It's really a great pleasure for me to introduce you to the closing lecture of our Digital Theme Week and to our speaker today, Professor Jin-Wook Shin, far away in Seoul, South Korea. Welcome again to Hamburg and at our Humanities Center, and good evening to Seoul, where it is, I think, 6 p.m. right now. Um, the theme week, Capitalism and Sustainability, basically raises three questions. How exactly is the ecological destruction of our planet causally related to capitalism? How realistic is it that capitalism can be changed in a sustainable way? And what would be conceivable alternatives to capitalism? The first of these three questions has been the topic of the keynote that Jason Moore gave us on Monday night. In his lecture, he argued that the ecological devastation of the Earth system is the most direct consequence of a capitalist accumulation regime whose basis is the exploitation of nature as a cheap and, if possible, completely cost-free resource. In a workshop on Wednesday, Ulrike Herrmann, Lisa Knoll, Ali Aslan-Gümüşay, and Klaus Dörre discussed this analytical perspective and highlighted what alternatives to ecological destruction there might be beyond capitalism or even within the capitalist economic system. Implicitly, a rather European North American perspective has been adopted in most of our discussions so far. This is going to change with today's lecture, which addresses current developments of capitalism in East Asian countries. Indeed, there exist numerous good reasons for this shift. East Asian countries belong to the fastest growing economies in the world. Among the G20 countries with the largest GDP, China ranks second, Japan third, and South Korea 12th. At the same time, these countries are also at the forefront of greenhouse gas emissions. China in first place, Japan in the fifth place, and South Korea, comparable with Germany, in the following places behind. Simultaneously, East Asian societies are undergoing serious changes in their social structures. Now, we have the exceptional opportunity to learn more about this firsthand from a renowned sociological expert from South Korea. Professor Jin-Wook Shin holds a professorship in sociology at Chung-Ang University in Seoul, one of the best sociological departments in the country. His special fields of sociological interests are social inequality and social conflict, civic society, welfare state, and political sociology, on which he has published books and articles in Korean, English, German, and Japanese. Recently, he gained insights into the discourse on structural change in South Korea after the corona crisis and in the debate on sustainability by being a member of a presidential commission on policy planning and participating in its advisory meetings. With Germany, Professor Chin has a long academic relationship. After graduating at Yonsei University, Seoul, he received his PhD in sociology at the Free University of Berlin, where his doctoral supervisor was Professor Hans Joas. Later, He was a visiting professor at Free University of Berlin and fellow of Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. We met in person during my stay at a visiting scholar at Seoul National University in 2015 and had very interesting discussions on various occasions. All the more, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Shin here at our Humanities Center, albeit unfortunately only virtually. Professor Shin, we are now looking forward to your lecture titled The Allure of Developmentalism and the Challenge for Sustainability in East Asian Capitalism. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Ich bedanke mich sehr herzlich für die Einladung. Das ist meine große Freude und meine Ehre. Hello everyone, I'm pleased to be invited to this fascinating and meaningful event hosted by the DFG Humanities Center at the University of Hamburg. I feel honored to have the opportunity to give lecture for my respected and colleagues and researchers. And I hope my presentation will give you some food for thought and useful information. Now let me share the screen and start my lecture. Today I was given a heavy theme called Kapitalismus und Nachhaltigkeit, Capitalism and Sustainability. For me, these two concepts appear to be not so much forward-looking and encouraging slogans as an unfortunate language that condenses the most pressing and serious challenges that our world society is has been facing, but could not solve. This theme is concerned with social inequalities and poverty, concentration of wealth, the alienation of work and workers, the exploitation of humans and nature for profit and capital accumulation, the disintegration of families and social communities and our human ties, and the threat to the reproduction of the ecosystem of our planet. So therefore, we cannot stress enough how serious such problems truly are and how urgent it is to elaborate and implement our policy alternatives are needed. However, as a political sociologist, I'd like to focus today on the problem of power, politics, and hegemony. We'll be talking about the historically embedded structural conditions and the power structure that sustain the socially and ecologically unsustainable capitalist order. In addressing such a question, East Asian countries which have achieved the most successful capitalist development after World War II, but did so little to respond to social inequality and ecological crisis, must be very interesting and notable example. So to begin with, I briefly give you a general outline about the themes, the object, and the storyline of my lecture today. So within the grand theme of this event, capitalism and sustainability, I gave a title to my lecture, The Allure of Developmentalism and the Challenge for Sustainability in East Asian Capitalism. The success story of economic development in East Asia have been told over and over again for the past decades. But I'm not going to say anything today about the secret to the success of the East Asian economy. The reason why the East Asian capitalism may be interesting for our discussion about capitalism and sustainability is something else. Because it is an example that shows how a successful developmental regime, a social and political system that has been highly efficient for growth, profits, and wealth for the rich, is threatening social and ecological sustainability by its very success and efficiency. By developmentalism, I mean a belief system or an ideology that gives a priority to economic development and assumes that other social needs and values can be met as an incidental result of economic development. In my view, in many countries in East Asia, developmentalism in that sense still has the hegemonic power and material foundation that can allure people and political decision makers, even though the time for authoritarian developmental state is past. At the same time, such developmental regime is revealing increasingly serious limitations and cracks. So there are growing challengers trying to limit the pursuit of growth and profits to defend social, ecological, and humanistic values. In my lecture today, I'll tell you about this political dynamic in East Asia and its implication for other parts of the world and our understanding of the theme, capitalism and sustainability. A number of theoretical and strategic issues and future agendas are included at the intersection of the issue of capitalism and sustainability. There are many keywords that are needed that we need to consider and discuss, including sustainable development, low carbon economy, eco-socialism or green capitalism, ecological democracy, and post-growth state and just transition, etc. Perhaps in the keynote speech of this event, Professor Jason Moore may have said that at the very heart of all these issues is the problem of capitalism. Following such a viewpoint, my questions are like this. Will companies not only support the green economy as a source of new profit, but will agree to that even when they have to give up some part of their profits? Are companies advocating smart economy willing to pay more taxes to the government, not just getting government support for R&D and new industry? Are governments ready to strengthen regulations to protect workers' rights and interests while supporting companies for a low carbon economy? And where these questions arise, the concrete meaning, motives, and issues of sustainability will become clear. So, what is as important as what visions and goals are spoken about sustainability is the question of who speaks for what, who is on the stage, who has the right to speak and decide, who has the power to define the problems and goals and to make their definition a universal consensus. This is my favorite picture because it shows a comprehensive list of the core values of our world. As you all know, at the United Nations General Assembly in 2015, a total of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and corresponding 169 targets were announced. This reflects the advancement of the idea of sustainability that replaces the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, established in 2000. Today, many national and local governments, and international organizations are advocating SDGs, and the CEOs are advertising their ESG goals in this context. But I'd like to ask, we need to remember what happened in the world in the 21st century. There was a boom in the global housing market. There was a huge concentration of wealth. The subprime collapse occurred in the United States. That led to the global financial crisis, and Southern Europe suffered a painful time of economic crisis. There were no alternative powers to control and transform the casino capitalism, to borrow the term from Hans Werner Sinn. And now, MDGs have been replaced by SDGs. It should be different this time, but in order to eradicate poverty, and hunger, to reduce inequality of wealth and income, to enable good health and education for all, and to make urban spaces more humane, and to respect the ecological order of nature, we must have the capacity to limit the huge economic powers and their friends in politics. Visions of change that do not touch this problem is empty. So how should we deal with the issue of sustainability? There are various ways to define the concept of sustainability or sustainable development and to derive its policy implications. I think the approaches that have made special contributions to the development of the sustainability agenda have had three elements in common: the systemic, the temporal, and the spatial perspectives. The most essential among them, I think, is a holistic, relational, and ecological way of understanding our social and natural systems. It means not to understand individual sectors such as economy, politics, culture, and nature in separation from each other, but to emphasize the relationship, connectedness, and systems of mutual influence. This connectedness has a temporal and spatial dimension. Sustainability can be assured through responsibility and consideration of the consequences of the present action, event, or conditions at a later point of time. Also, we must prevent the relations of domination and subordination, exploitation and sacrificing between different spaces at the global, regional, national, and local level. Now, I'd like to further simplify the holistic way of thinking into the relationship between the economic, the social, and the environmental. As we may know, the World Summit on Social Development in 2005 formulated the three pillars of a sustainable development as economic development, social development, and environmental protection. Accordingly, a series of international sustainability standards have been established. The picture you see shows three models. First, theoretically, a future where economic, social, and environmental values are balanced. Second, in reality, economic values comes first, and the social and ecological values are in a subordinate or peripheral position. Thirdly, strategically, the social should be strengthened and ecological values should penetrate both the economy and society. From the perspective I've just mentioned, we can assess the position of various perspectives on the transition to a sustainable society. In this graph, one axis is the question of how much diverse social groups, social forces are included in a program of transition. The other axis relates to the question of how much you hope to transform the existing social structure. The inclusive and structural approaches tend to go together. Insiders of the present institutional regime will prefer the visions in the lower left, while the visions that are advocated by those who challenge the center of the existing systems will be located in the upper right. I guess the more unequal the political, economic, and cultural power relations in a particular societies are, the more the public discourses on the future of sustainability of that society will be distributed in the lower left. Here's an example of interesting empirical study. One of the authors, Professor Katrina Zimmermann, is a sociologist, a junior professor at the University of Hamburg. This study analyzed the performance of each country with a two-dimensional model that includes the social and the ecological dimensions. My question is, where East Asian countries such as China, Japan, and South Korea will be located in this field? I guess their place is likely to be somewhere in the lower left corner. In the data I will show you soon, you will see that East Asian countries have been economically more successful than any other regions in the world over the past decades, but have been made solid for social and ecological sustainability. As you see in this table, so this is political preconditions for a post-growth political economy. In this table, the balance between the economic, the social, and the ecological is political issues. It is closely related to the political system, power structure, and the characteristics of political power alleys of a society. In this table, the state plays a crucial role in realizing a post-growth economy. The state must have the will and the capacity to limit economic activities to the limit acceptable in social and ecological values. And it should also be able to make sure that no area and no social class is sacrificed for transition in certain areas and for certain classes. These political preconditions are very demanding in reality. Real change can be expected only when the social and political forces pursuing visions that include the interests and voices of the socially disadvantaged and politically underrepresented become a meaningful alternative. Now, let me get into the story of East Asia in more detail. I'll start with the economy and the capitalist developments in East Asia since the second half of the 20th century. As you can see in this graph, for more than half a century since the 1950s to the present day, the economic growth rates in East Asia have outperformed all other parts of the world. North America and Western Europe were economically the most advanced regions in the year of 1950, but East Asia continued its fierce pursuit for catching up for decades. Asia's share of the global economy has also steadily increased. In the 1960s, Asia and Oceania accounted for only 15% of the world's total GDP, but in 2008, they have a similar share to the European Union and the United States. Besides the total volume of national wealth, the average purchasing power of East Asians has also increased steadily and steadily over the past 70 years. In particular, the rare cases that had GDP per capita of a medium and low level in the 1960s, but entered the high-income country group in the 2000s were mostly East Asian countries. They include Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and China. Moreover, since the 1990s, when Japan's long-term recession began, the level of GDP per capita in East Asian capitalist economies has converged. So now, let me talk about what role the state and politics played in this process of economic growth. The key word related to this issue is definitely the developmental state. The two core characteristics of the developmental state First, the pursuit of economic growth, and second, bureaucratic rationality. In a sense, these two may have something to do with what Max Weber and later the scholars of the Frankfurt School consider the essence of the instrumental rationality of modernity. The idea of developmental state was introduced as one of the strongest factors that explain the rise of East Asian economies from the 1960s, first Japan, then the so-called four East Asian tigers, including Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The theories of the developmental state initially emphasized the leading role of the state, but later paid more and more attention to the networks and interdependence between the state and business groups. However, I'd like to add, we should not overlook the fact that the social partners of the developmental state did not include the trade unions and nonprofit sectors. Such exclusion is an important cause of social and ecological destruction. The core of the developmental state is first, the existence of a relatively autonomous state institutions. Second, the networks of politics, bureaucrats, and business. And third, the priority of economic growth and the political legitimacy through the performance in this respect. Such developmental states have declined since the 1990s as a consequence of and as a response to international liberalization and globalization and domestic democratization and the growth of the business sector. However, in East Asia, the government still exerts or tries to exert a strong authority over the economic sector, and their policy ideas give top priority to economic growth and also the state performance in promoting the growth. Moreover, the strongly growth-oriented and nationalist culture still predominates in many So, while the former developmental state, or today the growth-oriented state in East Asia, strongly promoted economic growth, they were very passive in social spending. So, the main way to meet the material needs of the people in East Asia has been the private welfare through economic growth. As you can see from this graph, South Korea continues to have extremely low level of government welfare expenditure relative to GDP. Japan's public welfare expenditure is now at moderate level, but was very low in the 1960s and still lower than most OECD countries in 1990. Ian Holiday called this kind of East Asian welfare system a productivist regime. As is well known, Esping Andersen distinguished the three logics of social policy, but Holiday has pointed out that in East Asia, such a logic itself was unclear. According to Ian Go, what is at issue here is not different logics of the welfare state, but the existence of a consistent welfare state logic and the position of social policy per se. In East Asia's productivist welfare capitalism, social policy was subordinated to the objective of economic growth, and social policies were supported as long as they serve as a means to generate economic growth. Surely, the relevance of this model in each East Asian countries varies, And the political and institutional configurations of the welfare state in this region have changed a lot for the past decades. Nevertheless, this primacy of economic growth, I think, still persists in general in this region. So while the East Asian governments allocate a small budget for social and labor policies, it has been very active in investing in R&D for the advancement of economy and technology. R&D investment relative to GDP in South Korea and Japan ranks first and second in the world, respectively. This contrasts with the scale of social spending in these countries. Small and medium-sized welfare states in East Asia support and promote the business efficiently with small financial capacity of the state. This graph shows the trend of the size of total tax revenue as a percentage of GDP in OECD countries. Japan and South Korea have been at the lowest level in the last few decades. Instead, East Asian governments have developed a highly administrative and bureaucratic rationality. Japan has the most professional government officials, and the governments of South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore have both the highest professionalism and bureaucratic rationality, including the level of education, expert knowledge, and the meritocratic principles in recruitment, promotion, and reward. What we have seen so far was the diverse aspects and conditions of the successful capitalist development in East Asia. Such economic success, however, has increasingly approached the limits of social and ecological sustainability. What I tell you for the rest of this lecture is that such a contrast between success and failure is not accidental, but of a structural nature. I will first consider the social dimensions, then move on to the ecological aspects. Capitalism in East Asia is two-sided. On the one hand, both the national economy and the average level of wealth for individuals have risen markedly. In addition, the government has developed efficient bureaucratic competence and cooperation networks with companies. But on the other hand, East Asian capitalism faces not only the previously mentioned low public welfare, but also bad working conditions, weak labor organizations, and growing inequality and poverty, and fierce competition by private investment for their own future. So let's look at the statistical facts. In 2015, South Korea, Japan, and China were countries that had to work much more than most rich countries. And the problem of inequality is also serious. The distribution of disposable income in South Korea and Japan is more unequal than most countries in the West. The degree of relative poverty is also high. Especially in South Korea, the difference in poverty rates according to by gender is much greater than in other countries. These facts suggest that in many countries in East Asia, the old scheme of private welfare and relatively equal distribution through economic growth no longer works. While the total and average economy continues to rise, society is internally polarizing. In such an environment, people compete to survive. In East Asia, in particular, economic inequality and life cycle polarization according to the level of education are very high. However, because the degree of decommodification of education is extremely weak, people have to rely on private spending, which further exacerbates social inequalities. Now let me move on to the issue of ecological unsustainability in East Asia. Since we cannot discuss in detail due to time limitations, I will only show representative facts showing the current situation in East Asia. First of all, it is greenhouse gas emissions. The situation in Asian countries is not positive in this respect. In particular, China and India, along with the United States, are contributing greatly to the damage to the global ecosystem. This graph is a trend from the 1990s to the present. The blue line, China's increase in emissions, is by far the most remarkable. And India, the red line, has seen a steep increase in recent years. These graphs are an increase in CO2 emissions. Among the OECD countries, energy-related CO2 emissions from Mexico and Chile grow by an average of 1.1% per year, and emissions from South Korea increase by an average of 1 point per year. For other OECD member countries, CO2 emissions increase by far less than 1 point per year. And non-OECD Asia accounts for about 59% of the growth in world CO2 emissions from 2012 to 2014. China's emissions grow by an average 1 point per year, but they account for 41% of the total increase in non-OECD Asia's emissions. India's CO2 emissions increased by 2.7% per year. As you can see in this graph, Mexico and South Korea are countries that have pursued off, that pushed off legally binding carbon neutral policies, even though they account for a large part of global CO2 emissions. This fact cannot be unrelated to the actual increase in CO2 emissions in these countries. In 2020, when the world was in the midst of a coronavirus crisis, political leaders of China, Japan, and South Korea made several declarations in support of a green transition. China's President Xi Jinping said in a speech at the United Nations General Assembly on September 22 that emissions will peak in China before 2030 and will reach carbon neutrality by 2060 and will strengthen carbon dioxide reduction policies to achieve this goal. Japan's Prime Minister Suga also declared his vision of carbon neutrality by 2050 in his parliamentary speech on October 26. This announcement is clearly a step forward from the standpoint of the Japanese government so far, which has said it will reduce its carbon neutrality by 80% by 2050. And lastly, South Korean President Moon Jae-in also declared carbon neutrality until 2050 on October 28 and promptly established the 2050 Carbon Neutrality Committee affiliated with the president. And on December 7 on the same year, the South Korean government announced a strategy for promoting carbon neutrality. However, it is not at all clear today whether substantial policy programs and legally binding measures will follow these sudden declarations by the political leaders in East Asia. Finally, the major event we cannot miss regarding the ecological crisis in East Asia is the 2011 Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. The direct cause of this disaster was the tsunami, a natural disaster. But the reason why the tsunami led to the nuclear disaster is its structural and political nature. The safety of nuclear power plants in Japan has long been a problem since the 2000s, but the Japanese government has ignored such signals. In Japan, after the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear was first perceived with fear and trauma. However, Japanese society has become increasingly insensitive to the risks and costs of nuclear energy. The Fukushima disaster shocked such a regime, but the opponents of nuclear power lack organizational and political resources to transform the nuclear regime. This situation is no different in South Korea. Immediately after the Fukushima disaster, I remember the German government, Prime Minister Angela Merkel, reinforced the nuclear power plant policy. I mean, denuclearization. But in South Korea, the neighboring country of Japan, neither the government nor public opinion raised awareness about the risks of nuclear power plant. Perhaps if the calculation is made that the nuclear power plant is economically less efficient, then South Korea will achieve it in the shortest time. I have talked about the characteristics of East Asian economy and state and society in terms of the capitalist development and social ecological sustainability of the past few decades. Now let me narrow our focus to the most recent situation and see if East Asia's response to COVID-19 and its consequences reaffirms the traits I've spoken about so far. As you may know, countries in East Asia have successfully curbed the spread of COVID-19. This graph shows the trend of daily new infections per million people above the past year, 2020. China, Taiwan, and South Korea continue to maintain the lowest levels in terms of international comparison. This graph shows the number of daily new deaths due to COVID-19 per million people. Again, Taiwan, China, and South Korea are at the lowest level along with New Zealand. This table shows the cumulative total number of infected and deaths so far. South Korea, China, and Japan are at the lowest level along with New Zealand. Although not included in these statistics, Taiwan has even much fewer victims than its East Asian neighbor countries. How did East Asian governments react to this unprecedented pandemic crisis? For this question, we surely need much more research and discussion. So I still cannot say for sure about the exact nature of the reaction of the East Asian governments. But what many prior analyses, including of my own, indicate is that East Asia response to COVID-19 is not characterized primarily by strict lockdown and strong state interventions. Rather, what stands out here is the government's prompt decision and implementation in close cooperation with the private sector. The graph you see here shows an analysis of the research team at the Blavatnik Institute at the University of Oxford, the red line is the stringency of the government response, and the black line is the number of confirmed cases per day. And the axis X is the evolution of time. When the pandemic crisis began, the governments of China and South Korea immediately took measures before the explosive spread of infection and concentrated all their administrative capacities to implement the measures. Thereafter, the governments maintained a moderate level of stringency after the spread of infection stopped. In contrast, in the United States and in the United Kingdom, in the lower right part of the graph, responded only after the big blow of the pandemic, so it became continuously difficult to contain the virus that had already spread every corner of the country. Accordingly, the government's response had to be raised to a very high level of stringency. What I'd like to emphasize is the fact that governments in East Asia were able to immediately implement the swift and comprehensive measures. It requires a high level of administrative capacity on the one hand, and a hierarchical bureaucratic system capable of concentrating the energy of a huge number of people in a short period of time on the other hand. This is one of the typical traits of the legacy of East Asian developmental states. This graph shows the stringency and duration of lockdown in Asia and Oceania. You can see that China and South Korea not only have the lowest peak value of stringency index, but also the number of days of maximum lockdown is much lower than that of New Zealand and Australia. What is more interesting is the readiness of the citizens to cooperate with the government measures, or even urge the government to react as quickly as possible to prevent greater damages. In South Korea, whenever an infection begins to spread, citizens reacted before the government took measures. Look at the graph that compares the timing of the risk perception of the government and the citizens in South Korea. The line with the black circle, this one, indicates the reduction of mobility of the citizens, while the line without the circle is the stringency of government measures. So far, South Korea has suffered several waves, and in most cases, a marked reduction of citizens' mobility preceded the strengthening of the government measures. And the Korean government has always been pressured by public opinion, demanding as fast and efficient response as possible. In the economic aspects as well, countries in East Asia have minimized the economic losses from the COVID-19 crisis as a result of successful control of the virus. As you see in this graph, in 2020, China and South Korea had the best performance in GDP growth rates last year. And this graph shows that the degree of minimizing the economic loss from COVID-19 is inversely proportional to the total number of people infected. At this point, we need to think about the political considerations of East Asian governments. Why did the governments in East Asia react so quickly and mobilize all their resources to minimize infection and to minimize lockdown? The spread of infections or long-lasting lockdowns resulting in a fall of GDP and a restriction of economic activities, would have politically devastating consequences in East Asia. Please remember, economy, growth, economic performance of the government, these have been the top priority among many desirable social values within the developmental historical bloc of this East Asian region. However, we should not overlook the other side of the coin. That is, no significant reform has occurred in East Asia to compensate for the institutional weaknesses in social and ecological aspects. No significant changes among the economic and political elites to take advantage of the pandemic's experience to strengthen the fragile social safety net and public health care system. According to a survey conducted by my research team last year, around a half of South Korean citizens experienced income loss, and even worse, the low-income strata suffered more from income loss than the higher income strata. If you look at the graph on the right side, in many European welfare states, the proportion of people who experienced income loss due to COVID-19 was much lower than South Korea, even though European countries have suffered a great deal of infections and the total size of their GDP fell sharply. This is a matter of distribution and solidarity. Let me summarize. Rapid and efficient government intervention, successful crisis response, continuation of economic growth, as contrasted with deepening social inequalities, continuing weaknesses of social security, and no significant institutional reform for social sustainability. All these facts consistently indicates a strong legacy of the developmental regime in this region. As such, developmental regimes and strategies have been quite successful in one aspect this time again. So far, I've focused on how the success of the developmental system has been deepening social and ecological unsustainability in East Asia. But East Asian societies are by no means static. On the contrary, East Asia now has more and more active social movements for reform and growing political dynamics. In Japan, part-time workers and temporary workers movements called the Furita, and the precarious movement in a broader sense have been very active around since 2000. And after the Fukushima disaster, massive anti-nuclear protests took place for months in major cities of Japan. This kind of large-scale political protest was the first to recurrent after the trauma of left-wing terrorism in the 1970s. And in addition, youth in Japan have waged a massive campaign for years to call for genuine, real democracy and peace in East Asia. In South Korea, citizens' peaceful political participation demanding better democracy has expanded significantly since the early 2000s. And moreover, non-regular workers, especially young people and women, are leading the new wave's revitalization of Korean workers' activism today. In addition, actions that urge the government to respond more actively to the climate crisis are spreading. East Asia in the 21st century is changing, but the final question is again, will these new movements and actors have the power to change the politics, policies, and institutions? Now I will wrap up my lecture with conclusive statements. Here's a summary of the key messages of today's lecture. The very success of developmentalism is economic, technological, and administrative bureaucratic rationality in East Asia was a major cause of the deepening crisis of sustainability. And the legacies of developmentalist policy ideas, political authority, and everyday culture show the strong resilience after the end of the era of a developmental state and the coming of the era of neoliberal world capitalism. And the developmentalist historical bloc, to borrow from Antonio Gramsci's terminology, comprising the politicians, bureaucrats, big business, and the established media, has been the major obstacle to change toward more social and ecological sustainability. And finally, a substantial progress in social and ecological sustainability in this region is therefore not just a matter of adding a set of new policies and declarations and discourses, but of transforming political elites and the power structure. I think that this kind of paradox of success, the paradox between economic growth and the threat to sustainability, as experienced in the East Asian region, has implications for other parts of the world, including Europe. Capitalist development on one side and social ecological sustainability on the other side cannot easily reconciled, and we should not be allured to such a safe promise. If the economic and political center of a society makes growth and profit as their top priority, then social and ecological values are accepted only as long as it meets their goals and interests. Hence, the importance of politics, power structure, and configuration of actors in determining the actual developmental path of the sustainability agenda. Thank you very much.